Thank you, Christian. Oh, welcome. My name is Tim, and I get to serve on the teaching team. I want to say welcome to you and whoever you are watching with today. Welcome to Hillcrest. I want to invite you right now to pull out your Bible and begin turning to Matthew chapter 2. Matthew is the first book in the New Testament. It's right after Malachi. It's right before Mark, and we'll be getting there in just a moment. We are continuing our Light in the Darkness Advent series today. And, this series, we're really looking at these images from Scripture that describe the arrival of Jesus as light in the darkness. And our genuine hope is that in December 2020, that in a distinctive and personal way, you would find Christ to be a light in the darkness for you. So, Matthew 2 is where we're going to be today, and I want to pick up. We're just going to dive right in. Matthew 2, verse 1. This is how it begins. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem. Now, right away, you probably hear that, and you're like, I know this story, the Magi and the star, the state. I've heard this one before. Okay, hang with me. There's a few things right away I want to clear up that might be a little different than you had in your imagination. One, so as we go through this account of these Magi visiting Jesus, it looks like this is probably sometime after Jesus was born. Later on, it talks about Joseph and Mary living in a house. It looks like they've settled down for some time in Bethlehem. So this is not happening the night Jesus was born with the shepherds at the same time. It's sometime after that. Number two, notice that this King Herod is alive at this point. Herod is a historical figure, Herod the Great. He died around the year 4 BC. So most scholars think that what we're reading here takes place between the years 6 and 4 BC. Thirdly, Magi. I just want to talk about these Magi for a moment. Sometimes you'll hear about them described as kings, the three kings. Most likely they were not kings. Magi it was a known position in the ancient Near East. You could describe it as a pagan astrologer priest. These were people probably from Babylon or Persia, modern-day Iraq or Iran, and they studied the stars. There was a common belief back then that what was happening in the stars was connected to events on earth. And so especially events like the birth or death of kings, you could foretell them by things that were happening in the stars. So these were pagan astrologer priests who would study the stars. They were star readers, future tellers, telling where things would go. Yeah, Persia or Babylon off to the east from Israel. And these were people in other historical texts. We have Magi visiting other rulers as they came to the throne around this period. And so these were the ones coming to Jerusalem. All right, picking up in verse 2. So they come to Jerusalem and ask, verse 2, where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. So these Magi, these pagan astrologer priests, they show up and they say, hey, where's the king? We saw something in the night sky that told us that there was going to be a new king born to the Jewish people. Where is he? Now, followers of Jesus over the centuries have asked the fascinating question, what did they see? And there have been all sorts of proposals about what they saw, and as modern science has gained a better understanding of kind of cosmology and different events that would have happened during that time, there's been a lot of different proposals. And honestly, we just don't know exactly what they saw that led them to believe a new king was being born to the Jewish people. That being said, as I was kind of studying up on this, there was one proposal that I just found fascinating that I want to share with you today. So I just found this super interesting. So there are these two planets, Jupiter and Saturn, that you can see with the naked eye in the night sky. They look like stars, but because they're planets and much closer to Earth than the stars, they move across the night sky in different ways. And Jupiter is known as like the kingly planet, the royal planet. And Saturn was actually attached to the Jewish people because Saturn is attached to Saturday, Saturn's day, which is the Sabbath of the Jewish people, and so it was attached to the Jewish people. So Jupiter and Saturn, they orbit around the sun, and every 20 years there's an event called the Great Conjunction, where every 20 years, Jupiter and Saturn, from Earth's perspective, will be right next to one another in the night sky. Every 20 years this happens. So fairly rare, but even more rare than that is something called the triple conjunction. Is every few centuries or so, Jupiter and Saturn will actually come up right next to one another in the night sky 3 times in the same year. So with the help of a friend, a stargazing friend in our congregation, Gary Drost, I actually have an animation of this. So I want to show this to you now. Can we play this video? So here's Jupiter and Saturn. They're coming next to each other once. They come very close together. Keep going. And then they come back, come close to a second time. And then they go, and then they come close a third time. And they're called a triple conjunction. And what you're watching is actually the night sky over 7 months as viewed from Jerusalem in the year 7 BC. So in the year 7 BC, you had this very rare triple conjunction of Jupiter, the royal planet, with Saturn, the planet attached to the Sabbath, and hence the Jewish people. And we don't know if this is the thing that these pagan astrologer priests saw. But I find it fascinating. What if that is what drew them? And I find it just fascinating to imagine them in Babylon or in Persia, seeing this event in the night sky, and then making the decision to travel. Here we have a map. Whether it's Babylon or Persia, regardless, you're talking about at least a 1,000-mile journey across the ancient Near East, like crossing oceans of sand, that you might meet this newly born King of the Jews. So these magi come, they show up in Jerusalem, and then they say, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." I want you to notice these are the only words we ever hear the Magi speak. The only words they ever speak is, "Where is the one born King of the Jews? We've come to worship him." I think it's meant to show it. This is the driving search they are on. They are longing to find this newly born King of the Jews and to pay homage to him. This is their drive. This is their longing. And I find myself wondering a couple things. One, I find myself wondering what is driving them on. Where does this desire to meet the King of the Jews come from? Did they know exiles, Jewish exiles in Babylon and Persia who talked to them about the promised Messiah? And then I also find myself wondering about a God who chooses to reveal himself to pagan priests through the medium of astrology. And I don't find this to me, and this is not a biblical endorsement of astrology. What I do believe it's an endorsement of a God who desires to find all people and draw them to himself. What kind of God does this? A God who desires to speak in the language that people understand. That if they would step out and risk, they would come and find a trail of breadcrumbs leading to his son. What kind of God does this? These pagan astrologer priests are the one God reveals the star to. So they ask in Jerusalem. Let's pick up again. They ask in Jerusalem about where's the one born king of the Jews. And in verse 3, we read this. When King Herod, that's the king we heard about, heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. The thing about King Herod was disturbed before this happened. King Herod was a violent megalomaniac. He had one of his wives and 3 of his own sons executed at different times of his life because he suspected them of moving in on his power. So it was natural that everyone was disturbed at this idea that there might be a new king born. Verse 4, it says, when he called together, this is King Herod, he called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law. He asked them where the Messiah was to be born. In Bethlehem in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written. And this comes from the book of Micah. Verse 6, but you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you, that is Bethlehem, will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. This is written by the prophet Micah about 700 years before the birth of Jesus. And it makes sense. There was a great Jewish king by the name of David who actually lived around the year 1000 BC, 1,000 years before Jesus. And so David, this great Jewish king, he was born in Bethlehem. And so when the prophets spoke about a coming Messiah like David who would be born, it wasn't surprising that God revealed to them this coming Messiah too would be born in Bethlehem. Even though Bethlehem remained a tiny village, this Messiah would come from there. And so these Torah scholars point out to Herod, this is where the Messiah would be born. So verse 7, then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go worship him. Oh, King Herod, he's so just wants to. King Herod, you need to understand, okay, he doesn't actually want to worship Jesus. He wants to kill Jesus. But what happens is that Herod says, hey, the scriptures tell us the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem. And the Magi go on without Herod, without the chief priests, without the Torah scholars, without the religious leaders. Here's a map. The Magi at this point, they traveled 1,000 miles just to come to Jerusalem. Jerusalem to Bethlehem is 5 miles. You walk that in an hour and 20 minutes. These Torah scholars, these religious leaders, can't be bothered to walk an hour and 20 minutes to find out if it's true that the Messiah has been born. Knowledge isn't enough. Verse 9. After they heard the king, they went on their way. And the star they had seen when it rose, went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. The star is over Bethlehem. Now, I think sometimes people hear this and they're like, don't you understand? The star is way up in the sky. It can't appear over a tiny village, let alone a particular place in the village. This is obviously a sign this story is made up. Check this out. There's a historian Josephus. He's a well-known first-century Jewish historian. He wrote about all different kinds of things. He wrote a lot about the Jewish rebellion against the Roman Empire later on in the first century, around the year 70. And when he was writing about Jerusalem's rebellion against Rome, he said this about Jerusalem, a different event, but listen to what he says about Jerusalem. Here's the quote from Josephus. Thus there was a star resembling a sword which stood over the city, that is Jerusalem, and a comet that continued a whole year. And so here we have a parallel historical writing from the first century talking about a star hanging over a particular point. And so we don't know exactly what the Magi saw when the star led them to Bethlehem, but the idea that this is that clearly first century Jewish people had some kind of understanding of how this kind of event could occur. Matthew, another person writing of historical events, says something similar. So they see the star, they go to Bethlehem. Verse 10, when they saw the star, they were overjoyed. Literally it says they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And then verse 11, on coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. They come in and they have these royal gifts, these three gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And the three gifts is where we get the tradition that there were three wise men. It never actually says how many wise men there were. There were these magi, these pagan astrologer priests. There could have been many more, but there are these three royal gifts, kingly gifts they bring. But I find the most poignant image to be this language. It says they bowed down. They prostrated themselves. This is not just a bending of the neck, but a prostrating of one's body on the ground. And I think about these grown men from 1,000 miles away, probably speaking a different native language, from a whole different religious upbringing, coming to this small village, Bethlehem, and kneeling in the dust. This image of searching and finding, of joy and of worship. The story ends and we read, and having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. There's always been something about the account of the Magi that I find very compelling. I find myself stirred by it. I think part of it is this contrast between these Torah scholars, these religious leaders, these people who study the scriptures, these people who God has done everything God can to reveal where his Messiah will be born. God desires these religious leaders to come and know his son when he is born. And yet, with all the knowledge and understanding they have, they can't be bothered to travel the 5 miles to see if the Messiah has been born. And you hold up them, and then you have these pagan astrologer priests who are in the dark in so many ways, spiritually and physically in the dark, searching the night skies, clearly longing for some kind of spiritual truth. And they see something, this pinprick of light, that makes them think there is this king, this Messiah to be born, and we want to meet him. And they cross a 1,000-mile journey over oceans of sand just that they might meet this Messiah of the Jewish people. I find myself compelled, challenged by this contrast. That God desired these pagan astrologer priests to know him. God drew them along And God allowed them to find his son, Jesus. One of my favorite Christmas songs is it's by a small folk band out of Vancouver called Ordinary Time, and it's a song entitled King of Kings. And I was going to play it for you, but I was told that Mark Zuckerberg would come to my house and get me in trouble. And so I'm going to read you the lyrics, and I encourage you to look it up, Ordinary Time, King of Kings. This song starts out, and we're going to have the lyrics on screen here. It's quiet, and it's just one single acoustic, a cappella voice, all alone, singing these words. The song starts out, "What would you do if you heard a voice that called you away, that left no choice? Would you sell all you had to follow a star? Would you trust it and leave your life behind?" There's this long tradition in the scriptures of God calling people away, of Abraham, God speaking to Abraham, calling him to a new country, of Jesus speaking about the pearl of great price and the treasure hidden in the ground, the Magi, the star appearing in the sky, of God seeking people who would step out and risk that they might see him and know him and encounter him. And I find myself thinking about this season that we're in, this darkness of 2020. And there's certain ways that it's really important right now that we stay home and stay safe. And yet I do find myself wondering, and this is not about COVID and masks and all that. This is about a deeper kind of orientation of our hearts. I wonder about an orientation that might seep into my heart of general risk aversion, of play-it-safeism, of an unwillingness to step out for what God might be calling me to. And I wonder about even seasons of darkness, how they might kind of encourage. I know in seasons of darkness, emotional, spiritual, physical darkness, there's a sense that it makes you want to curl in on yourself and stay home, not risk and not step out. And maybe even give us the impression that God's not active in that place. That God will be with us again when the light comes out. But right now we just need to hunker down. And I find myself just asking questions like, what do the Magi, what do they call me to? What does it mean for me to be like these Magi? What do they have to teach me? I find myself thinking about the fact that these Magi, they were in literal spiritual darkness. They were in literal physical darkness. And there's this sense that in this darkness, that star, whatever they saw, God could only reveal it to them in the darkness. And even in this season of darkness of 2020, I wonder if there's things that God can only call us to. God can only invite us into. God can only reveal to us in the darkness when other things are not blocking out our vision. These Magi could only see the star at night. And they heard in that the invitation of God, and they followed it. So I talked about at the beginning, we don't know exactly what the Magi saw. Maybe it was this triple conjunction. We don't know for sure, but maybe. And I said that the triple conjunction is super rare, but this great conjunction where Jupiter and Saturn line up from Earth's perspective, that happens every 20 years. So not super common, but several times in a lifetime. Do you know the next time the great conjunction happens? Do you know the next time this occurs? Tomorrow night. Tomorrow night, Jupiter and Saturn will be as close in the night sky as they will be, actually not just in 20 years, but in like centuries and centuries, because they will be so close together. The evening of December 21st. And so this is what I wanted to invite us to. This is actually a picture from Al Leaf, part of our church family, a couple weeks ago. And you can see there's Saturn and there's Jupiter. They're starting to get close together. And so this is what I want to invite us to. Tomorrow night, or the next night that we don't have a cloudy, overcast night, I want you to go out sometime between the hours of like 5 and 6 p.m. It's right after sunset that you can see this. You look to the southwest sky, and Jupiter will be the first thing that you see appear in that direction. It'll be real bright, and then Saturn will be right next to it. You can also download one of those star finding apps. That'll be really helpful to find this. But I want you to look in that direction. And I want you to think about these pagan astrologer priests and their 1,000-mile journey. I want you to reflect on what God did to draw them, to reveal himself to them, to draw them to his Son. I want you to reflect on what they chose, how they chose to step out and search after. And I want you to think about your own life. And I invite you to ask some questions. Questions like, how is God desiring to draw you to his Son Jesus in this season? And how far would he go to draw you in? And how far will you go to respond? Let's do that sometime in the next week or so and see what God might say to us. Would you pray with me? Abba, Father, we honor you and worship you. I just think about the way that you are constantly seeking worshipers of your Son, that they might know your Son, they might be made right because of your Son, and that we might know you as well. And I thank you for the story of these magi. Thank you for their courage. I thank you, Spirit, the way you drew them. I thank you, Spirit, for the way you inspired Matthew to record this story for us as an image, a picture of what you desire to do in each one of our hearts. And so I just pray that for us as a community, even as we see these stars in the night sky over the days and weeks to come, Lord, would you speak to our hearts about how you desire to draw us? In your good name I pray. Amen.